Yahoy. Greetings, world. Welcome back. We're back with Beers with Max, and I have since recovered. For those of you playing the home game, I've since recovered from the pneumonia, and I'm excited to talk to my guest today, Marcel Petitpas. Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yes, circle gets
Very
the
good.
square. It's difficult to do, folks. I'm telling you. About non-alcoholic beers. Marcel, you've brought a 10-calorie brilliant.
Yes.
It's called
Partake Brewing,
Partake,
right?
as it
Calgary,
as it would.
Canada, Canadian company.
Now, I spent 5 days in Las Vegas at a 3-day golf tournament for the first time, really exploring the non-alcoholic space because I had pneumonia. And the desert's a great place to go play golf when you have pneumonia. Not really. But yeah, what a scene, the non-alcoholics today. My favorite, I have to say, is the Guinness Zero.
Yeah, really good.
Like you can't even tell the difference. But unfortunately, now that I'm better, I will be partaking in a little Whistle Pig piggyback. They unfortunately do not make a non-alcoholic version
Yeah.
of this particular rye whiskey.
This is the thing, right? Is non-alcoholic beer and cocktails. That category has absolutely exploded. What people have not figured out how to do yet. And I'm a big non-alcoholic guy. It's not that I don't drink alcohol. I just rarely choose to anymore. But of course, I love a beer. I love a wine, etc. The thing that I've found has not been cracked yet is people haven't figured out how to make drinks that have a lot of complexity, like wine and spirits, like a non-alcoholic whiskey. Nobody's really figured that out. And I think a lot of that has to do with one of the primary aspects that alcohol has as a property is that it's constantly evaporating. And I think that that is a big part of the reason that you can get such complexity on your palate from those kinds of things. And you can't really, it's very, very hard to replicate that with non-alcoholic other than using a vinegar, which is just going to have an overpowering taste to it. So whoever can figure that out, I think will do extremely well because this category is absolutely blowing up. Before it was vitamin infused things and now it's non-alcoholic things.
Yeah, well, you saw the same. So I saw it like there was the IPA thing where I was bloated out of my mind, but that was the cool category that had all the stories, that had all the cool cans, and then you started you started to see all these micro brews in the lower alcohol, like 4 to 5% pilsners and Kolsch's, and they started to get the micro scene and cool stories and really a lot of flavors. Then there was the claw my eyes out,
Like sours and
White
ciders.
Claw. Well, the whole seltzers and
Cocktails.
White Claw things. I think High Noon won that battle, but now it's the non-alcoholic. So I think it's just going to take time for them to figure it out. But I think it's getting enough attention.
Yeah.
Where like I can go to a bar, order a non-alcoholic, and I'm not like disgusted. I'm like, oh, this is actually pretty good.
Here's my thesis on where this is headed. If you look at the arc of this trajectory, it's all trending towards wellness, right? And because so you went from like basically like harder things to softer things. That was even like the all the rage with the non-alcoholic seltzers, or sorry, the alcoholic seltzers, was that there was almost no calories in them, no sugar, right? So that was like alcohol, but under a wellness frame. And now the ultimate wellness frame, which is alcohol without alcohol, which is obviously better for you than alcohol with alcohol. I think the next phase of this is going to be going up the other side of the ramp, which is like nootropic infused kinds of like drinks that actually create an experience, but via a wellness channel as opposed to an alcohol channel.
I get an ad every 3 scrolls. I get an ad for these mushroom infused cocktails.
Yeah, I think that's the next wave, but we're a few years prior to that really being mainstream. And I think you'll start seeing that in bars and stuff as well, being able to have nootropics as part of your experiential palate as opposed to just alcohol and increasingly cannabis.
Yeah. I had a health professional here on Beers with Max one time. I know it's surprising. And she informed me that the clear stuff is best. So there was like a few months where I just drank vodka on the show.
Nice.
I lost some weight, but hey, that's the one and only health professional I brought on. Maybe I need to broaden my perspective. What do you do, Marcel? Because it sounds like we could have a conversation about non-alcoholics all day, but
We could. I feel like you and I could talk about just about anything all day. But we should
and
probably
here
talk
we are.
about business. So what do? I help digital agencies measure and improve their profitability. I think the best way to describe that in layman's terms is my company, Parakeeto. We have developed technology and a process that helps do the job that someone in every agency does, but nobody knows what it's called. And it's the job of sitting in between finance, delivery and operations, and sales, and trying to make sense of what's going on in the business so that you can use data to help answer questions that you're asking yourself every day when you run a firm, which is like, are we making money on the work that we're doing? Are we busy enough? Are we going to have to hire some people? What if we do get this project? What if we don't? What if we do hire this person? What if we don't? What if we do raise our prices? What if we don't? Right? How are we doing? It's all simple stuff, but it's really actually not that straightforward to answer. Anybody that's run a firm would know that. So that's the kind of stuff that we help you get a grip on and have confidence and clarity on all the time.
Now, you say that it's somebody's job, but why is my immediate reaction, yeah, right? And in the agency community, like, nobody is thinking, for some reason, so there's like product companies where this is like a very serious role and someone's going, oh, costs, revenue, profit. Then there's the world of professional services where it gets a little more lackadaisical. And then there's agencies.
Yeah.
Which is like, I think, for lack of a really crisp word to describe it, like, no, they don't. For some reason, profitability is not on their radar. Why do you think that is? Do you have any theories? Like, is it the nature of the creative owners, or is it like is it because of the business model? Like, why?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think the first thing that it is that it doesn't lend itself very well to the interests of the majority of people running these companies. Right? Vast majority of the people running creative services businesses have a very similar story in that they were subject matter experts. They were really good at, for example, design, brilliant designer, started doing freelance work. Were so good at it that the consequence was way more work got thrown at them. All of a sudden they woke up one day, they had a business and they're like, shit, I don't know how to run a business. I'm just a designer that now has to learn how to be a CEO. So that's part of it. And they generally didn't sign up for having to be very involved in numbers and finance, et cetera. And then the second reason that I think it's lacking in this industry is because it's actually harder. Services is a particularly complex business model problem. It's a complex modeling problem. It's a complex data management problem. It's actually quite a bit harder than software because so much of the data is unstructured and not clean. And so it takes quite a bit actually of effort and sophistication to do this well in a small agency. And there are virtually no tools, technology, or best practices to support it because we've just come off of decades and decades and decades of infrastructure, ideas, methodologies that are built and hard-coded to time and materials as the only billing model on the planet. And now that, like, especially in the last 10 years, the vast majority of the industry has become very incompatible with that framework. There's this massive vacuum that, is part of the reason Parakeeto exists. We saw this vacuum and we were like, yeah, that's an opportunity. Let's go solve that problem. But there's a massive vacuum for ways of thinking and tools that help facilitate a modern approach to managing this information.
I also think it's far more personal. So if I was running a software company and, here's a profitability challenge, we need to raise our prices, or we need to dial back a feature or a level of service, you don't look many people in the eye and have that conversation with them. On a professional services side, there's a personal relationship. There's somebody's livelihood is attached to this difficult conversation you need to have. So I think one is recognizing where you're leaking profitability, and two, having the confidence or the culture to be able to have those real conversations with clients. At least that's my theory. Having run an agency, it's like, just because you know something that you need to do doesn't mean that your people are willing to have that conversation.
I think that there is some truth to that for sure. And we see, I think, mostly the avoidance of it also being a result of a more of an emotional component.
Yeah, like we're losing money, but we are afraid of having that conversation with the client because we're afraid of,
with the team,
for some reason, we're afraid of losing a client that we're losing money on.
or it could be letting people go. It could be recognizing that we're inefficient at what we do. It could be recognizing that our work isn't actually as good as we think it is. So we can't command the prices that we thought we could and hire all the talent that we thought we could. There's a lot of hard decisions that are often wrapped up in coming to terms with the reality of what's happening in the business. Yeah. So yeah, it's hard for a lot of reasons.
So I'm really interested in like what you're interested in, because you're in the space of profitability. I know we had like some bullet points that we wanted to cover, which I've forgotten, which is a byproduct of the Whistle Pig rye whiskey. But like one thing that I'll ask about is, what are people falling, like what is the number one thing that people aren't looking at that they should be looking at? Where it's like, gotcha.
Yeah, it's delivery margin, which you could think of as gross margin. That is like there was one metric that you could pay attention to in your business, that if it was healthy, chances are everything else would be fine. That's the one. And it's the one that almost nobody actually can see when they get their financial statements, which are some of the only information that they're using to gauge their level of success in their business. Almost none of them can actually see their real gross margin. And that's a big problem, in my opinion, because it's the lifeblood of profitability. Without that, everything else is hard.
So you said delivery margin. I mean, my translation of that as a not really financially literate, I can understand what people are saying, but I don't want to be the lead on that conversation. Revenue in from client, minus, like, you've got someone that needs to take care of that account. You've got software costs, like just looking account by account. How much money are we making per account? I believe that agencies aren't really keeping track of how many labor hours are going into individual accounts, like outside of just the calls. Like they miss the strategic conversations internally. So is that what you're talking about, of like how much money are we actually making per account, or is it deeper than that?
So yes and no. All right. So delivery margin, first, let's define it. And why do I use the word delivery margin instead of gross margin, which most people would be more used to hearing? And the simple reason for that is I'm so sick of arguing with accountants over semantic bullshit that I just called it something different so that we don't have to have an argument anymore. It's like, great, you want to do gross margin your way? No problem. Let's talk about this concept that I think is important for the client here to understand, which is, as you defined, revenue coming in, with the important caveat that we have to subtract from that revenue what we would call pass-through costs. So this is money that you might collect from a client, but it's actually not your money, right? So if a client gives you $100,000 a month, but you spend $80,000 on Facebook ads, is that a $100,000 client or is it a $20,000 client? Well, it's a $20,000 client to you, the agency, because only $20,000 of that was your money to begin with, right? So
which is very specific to marketing, because we're in charge of these budgets that are like going right out the door.
Yeah, marketing, but we see this in other industries too. Video production is a big one where you might outsource the production to a third party, right? So you're passing a lot of the production costs. You're collecting it from the client, you're passing it through to another party. You might keep the markup. That's a common thing. Industries where there's a lot of materials, you might see this. Industries where you might be designing a website, but you don't do any of the development, right? So there's lots of other examples of this, but you want to subtract out pass-through. So that's an important caveat on the revenue. What we're really paying attention to here is what we call agency gross income, which is after subtracting the costs of those pass-through expenses, but you can keep all the markup that you might apply to that. Like how much money is left over that you now need to earn with your time. So that's the revenue number in this calculation. And then the other side of that is, what does it cost you to earn that revenue? So to your point, what is the cost of the labor that goes into actually delivering the promises that were made to clients? What's the cost of like the tools and infrastructure that supports that labor? So if you have a team of designers, they probably have a Figma subscription. They probably have an Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, right? You're not attributing that to every single client or project, but those are tools that your team needs in their tool belt to do their job. And the first place to look at this is for the whole company, right? And what we're aiming for here is at least 50 cents of every dollar of AGI is left after the promise has been delivered to the client. So when you think about all the payroll and all of the software expenses that get allocated to delivery, is that greater than 50% of your agency gross income? And if the answer is yes, you're in a position where it will be very hard to be profitable, because you're probably going to spend another 30-ish% of your income on overhead. And that leaves you with ideally 20% or more to make a profit. So if you're below a 50% delivery margin, it's going to be problematic. And that's the first place I would look is for the whole business. And then the second question is, well, if that number is not very high, what is the reason for that? And there's three reasons that that could be. One of which is the margin on my individual projects is not high enough, right? But you could have every single project that you do be wildly profitable and still fail.
Yeah.
So reasons number 2 and 3 would be the team's not busy enough, right? So if I do 2 projects and they're super profitable, but I was paying a team that could have been doing 20 projects, well, I'm probably still losing money, right? It doesn't matter that those 2 projects were super profitable. It's good, but it's not all that's necessary. We need to also keep the whole team busy, have enough revenue to offset their costs. And then number 3 is average cost per hour. We need to make sure that our labor costs are reasonable relative to the average billable rate that we can earn, or the amount of revenue that we can earn relative to the cost of the labor that we employ. So those are kind of the 3 checks and balances that when we see poor delivery margin, which is 98% of the time that we audit an agency that's struggling with profitability, that's their problem. And then we dig into, okay, which of these 3 factors is most important to that problem, and which do we prioritize?
Yeah. Do you have any like off the cuff healthy, other unhealthy, healthy numbers, like 50%, your 50% delivery margin? Like I've talked to somebody that was a huge fan of revenue per full-time equivalent.
Yeah, I hate that metric so much.
Oh, you do? Perfect.
I do.
I
Yeah.
love controversy here.
Let's talk about it. Okay, so I don't
Let's pick a
fundamentally
fight.
hate the
I mean, it's
metric.
not
I
my
hate the way it's
number. I don't do
benchmarked.
numbers, but
Right. I hate the way that it's benchmarked. So really what revenue per FTE should be is a proxy for delivery margin. So I would have no problem with revenue per FTE if the way it was benchmarked was relative to your average cost per employee. That's a useful way to benchmark it, because then you can get a sense of what is the margin on that, right?
because there's so many, in other, if you don't do that, then there's so many other factors that could cause it to be skewed.
Right, because Max, if I tell you, hey, my revenue per FTE is 200 grand, is that good or bad? Well, you don't have enough information. If my entire team's based in San Francisco and my junior project manager gets paid 195 grand a year, well, that's pretty bad. Like the business probably isn't profitable. But if my whole team is in Bangladesh, I'm probably killing it. So you can't, and this is my issue with revenue per FTE, is people benchmark it in absolute terms. They say, oh, 100's bad, 150 is okay, 200 is good, 250 is great. But it's like, that's just not enough information. The benchmark should be a relative value. So I don't mind it, but I think I just want to be more mindful about how we benchmark it. Labor efficiency ratio, very similar, but I prefer labor efficiency ratio because at least it speaks to the relationship between for every dollar for every dollar you spend on labor, how many dollars of revenue do you earn, right? I think it's a better metric for getting a sense of like how performant is this actually in the context of this business.
What sort of like, so I admitted, I'm like, yes, this is, I love learning from people like you. It's not where my brain goes. I know that people need to be on the bench that do what you do. And I'm like, yes, we need to default to Marcel here. Where my brain goes is like, okay, what are we going to do about this?
Yeah.
And what I'd love to know is, are there some industry trends that, like macro trends, that you have found that have influenced these numbers in a negative way or a positive way? Like, what does the landscape look like? Is everyone struggling with project margin and you've got a theory that it's for a specific reason? Or should we just skip to like, here are some of the things you could do about this?
Okay, I'll separate my answer into two answers. So the first is like, what is my thesis on what's happening at a macro level in our industry?
Yeah.
And then the second part of the question will be, how would we think about counteracting that using the 3 vectors that are most effective?
Yeah. What's happening? What do we do? Yeah. That's a much, there you go. That's a much simpler question.
What's happening, I think, is that our industry is maturing in the sense that margins are getting worse. And I don't think that that is a result of some idiosyncratic macro or microeconomic change, right? Have there been some things that have accelerated that? Yes. COVID accelerated it in the sense that it pushed remote work forward by like a decade and created a rapid increase in the global competitiveness and the globalization of this service offering, right? Where it's like
supply increased
dramatically, right? Like there were still a couple of geographical barriers that kind of existed in advertising and consulting before, where it was like, oh, you might hire an agency that's in your same city, but like that's pretty much gone now, where it's like everyone's your competitor. There's people with geo arbitrage advantages that you just don't have. So like that was hard. That accelerated margin pressure. AI also accelerating margin pressure. We saw labor costs onshore go way up through COVID. That accelerated margin pressure. So things have moved very quickly, so it feels like it's all happening very suddenly. But the reality is that every market, every industry, over time, margins get worse as they get more competitive and players within those markets get more sophisticated. So my theory is that we're just going through that same natural evolution in our industry. And what it means is that, just like in every other industry, the level of sophistication required to just survive, not thrive, but just survive in this market is higher than it's ever been. And it's not enough anymore to just be a talented designer or a talented creative, or you also have to have business acumen, and you have to understand this business model well enough to operate within this new context, which I don't think is going to get any easier. And the second thing that leads to, in my opinion, is I see the supply chain getting more fragmented in the next decade. In the same way that, so I'm also an investor in a food business. So when you look at like how the food industry works, the margins are terrible. And if you actually look at how many different people a product that you put in your mouth go through before it makes it to the grocery store, that whole supply chain is super fragmented. Yeah. Like there's probably anywhere from 3 to 8 different companies that are involved in the process of taking something from a field to getting it on your plate, right? And that
I've seen the Netflix documentaries.
Right. It's pretty wild. The supply chains, and the same thing is true about like an airplane or an airline, right? Airlines are famous for having horrible margins. And when you think about the experience of going on an airplane, like, okay, I booked my flight with United, but the food, that wasn't them. That was a third party that specialized. The airport, that's not them. That's a third party that they lease from. The signage, that's not them. That's the agency that they hire. The people cleaning the plane, that's not them. That's a third party that they hire. And in some cases, even the flight attendants and the support staff, like you think about that business as being a business, but it's actually just an aggregation of a lot of specialized players within that supply chain. And the reason for that is the margins have gotten so tight that they have had to go from not just external specialization. Hey, we're an airline that specializes in this specific thing, right? Like Southwest, we're the budget airline with some flair or whatever their positioning is. I don't really know. Maybe that's an accurate depiction. That's their external specialization. But then internally, they're also now having to say, and we're going to specialize operationally in only running this specific aircraft so that our operations get more streamlined, and we're not going to worry about cleaning. We're not going to worry about food. We're going to outsource all of these other business functions that are not our specialization so that we can get efficient enough to carve out a good margin, and we can innovate in this one part of operations so that we can be competitive going forward. So what does that mean for agencies? Well, it's a lot more of this white labeling, a lot more of this partnering with other agencies, and really niching down at an operations level to like, what are we actually good at in terms of running the business? And what can we partner with other people to do so we can still offer a complete product to people, but we're not spread thin across a bunch of stuff that we suck at and we're not enjoying doing and slows us down from a perspective of scale. That's where I see us going in the next 10 years as a natural evolution that can be mapped to every other industry that's gone through it. And I think we're seeing the early signs of it already.
Yeah, that's a clip.
That's a clip. I don't know if you'll fit that into a social clip, but it's
that. It's social. I felt social about it. Look, if it's a legit rant, you can get 3-5 minutes, something like that. But yes, hell yeah to that. And that's a lot deeper than just saying, oh, you need to, there's efficiency in. There's riches
AI.
and niches. Yeah, is what people have been saying. It's like, oh, that's great.
Like that's been the last 10 years. Like we've done that. That's table stakes now. Okay, everybody understands you have to have a niche.
Well, and they still haven't done anything about it.
But some people, but most have. Let's agree that most people who are doing well, they've gone down that path already. So that now the question is like, well, what's next?
Well, there's like 2% of agencies that are doing well between your and I standards, and I think all of these things are piling on to force people to make some of these decisions, their labor model. To your point, how do we think about white labeling or maybe taking on fractional talent, because we've gone through 2 waves of layoffs in the past 2 years. But margins are getting worse. That is the key. And I love that you're talking about business acumen as a way to survive. Like, forget growing your business. If you want to survive, you need to take a course in operations, in business acumen. Like, you can no longer survive just by performing a good service, because clients can't tell the difference, and it's just not enough. There's too many people out there that can do the work for you to survive just based on that.
Yeah. I think that right now, it's not like you don't need an MBA. You don't need to become a CFO. You just need to understand your business model that you're operating. And it is alarming how many people running, by all objective measures, successful marketing and creative firms, several $1 million in revenue. When you really double click on it, they don't really actually know what their business model is and how it works. They don't understand the mechanics of, like, here are the different buttons I can push to increase profitability. Here are the consequences of pushing on this button in terms of how it affects the other ones. Like, there's just not a strong grasp on that. And that's not as big of a learning curve, like, especially today. Like, we have a course, right? There's lots of information out there, but like, that is the starting point for me, is like, if you run a business like this, you should understand how it works.
For 10 years, I've been asking people about what they know and how they monetize it. I know we had some really cool bullet points that I don't have in front of me. What are some of the systems that you've figured out that are like the core of your business that are worth talking about today?
Yeah. I would, and there's like a sequencing here. So if there's like a progression of how do you get a better grip on this, when we work with clients, we go through 3 steps and they build on each other. So the first step is you should have a model of your business, and you should understand what the model of your business is. So what does that actually mean? Well, essentially it means a model of your business that, I sound like an idiot. I sound like a consultant, really. What is a model? Well, a model is a model, but literally,
is it a business model, or is it a
it's
model
something that you can
business?
look at that outputs math, right? And connects the dots between the elements of your business that make up your business. So specifically your people, right? So it's comprised of a list of everybody on your team, how much they get paid, how many hours they work, how much time off they get, where their time gets spent. So that gives us an understanding of, okay, what do we spend on payroll? Where does that payroll go in the business? How much capacity do we have? How much time is available for doing client work versus other things? So that gives us a pretty big chunk of the model, because that is a service-based business. We are in the business of labor arbitrage. We purchase 2,000 hours of someone's life at a fixed rate,
and we resell
it at a profit.
people. Yeah, people hours.
That's what we do, right? You might not like that description, but that's the reality of the business that we're in, right?
Yeah, never tell a client that. Yeah.
No, yeah, but like, that's where we're at. So that's a big component of it. Then the second component of it is budgets, right? So then you have overhead. What are we going to spend on sales and marketing? What are we going to spend on administration? What are we spending on facilities if we have them, right? Office rent, et cetera. So now you have an understanding of some of the OpEx costs, the hard costs. And then the last piece is the pricing, right? So when we sell something, what are we expecting in terms of margin, in terms of average billable rate, right? Some measure of earning efficiency that we expect to see when we sell things. Those 3 things combined together should output the maximum amount of revenue that business can do if all of those things go perfectly. Exactly how much gross margin or delivery margin you'll make, exactly what percentage of your income will go to overhead, exactly how much will be left over, exactly what the maximum utilization is for that business, exactly what the average billable rate of that business will be, down to the dollar, how much will get spent in those different areas. And it'll tell you, like, okay, this is the best possible outcome. This business is designed to accomplish this if all of the assumptions that you've just made work out perfectly. That is a very insightful first place to look, because it tells you a couple of things. Number one, is your business designed to be successful? You'd be amazed, Max, at how many businesses we look at that are designed to fail, but there's no awareness of it.
I love that thought exercise. What happens if you're successful?
Right. Like everything that you have just articulated, what happens if it actually works?
Terrible.
Now, a lot of people do have a sound business model and they're underperforming relative to it. But I love to start here. And there's a couple of reasons why. It's fast. If you're using the right system, you can do this in an afternoon or as little as a week working with us, for example. it doesn't require any net new information. This is literally just structuring a bunch of assumptions in a way that creates more clarity. So we don't have to go track time. We don't have to go restructure our finances. We don't have to install any new tools. There's no new information required. It's all things that you already have or that you can create if you don't have them written down somewhere. And it solves a problem that no amount of financial management and time tracking and project management will ever solve, which is you're planning to fail and you didn't know it. There's nothing you can change about execution that's fixing that problem. That is existential.
Can I just make an observation? And that is, I've been asking agencies about their business model for 10 years. And your explanation starts with costs, the people in the overhead, the people in the hours, then goes into overhead. The final thing, the third thing that you're talking about is pricing. Now, if you go to any, if you go to any agency and say, what's your business model? They will start with what they're charging for their services. Mm-hmm. And it was just listening to you talk versus the 10 years of interviews I've had with agencies. They're enamored with what can I charge for the value I provide. And they either never get to or intentionally avoid the model of well, who are my people? What am I paying them? What is my overhead cost? So anyway, that was just an observation that just came to me listening to you talk. And I also love this idea of what is your best possible outcome.
Well, I'm really glad you brought this up too, because I think this is the conflation. I'll ask people about this on, for example, on a sales call, be like, oh yeah, tell me about your business model. And it's amazing how many people conflate their pricing model with their business model. Those are different
They're
things.
thinking that's what you're at. How much can you charge for your shit?
Yeah. And what's funny about that too is there's also often this belief that the pricing model somehow changes the business model, but it never does actually. If I'm selling you a flat rate website project for $100,000, or I'm selling you time and materials like hours, on the balance of the math behind your business model, those things all boil down to exactly the same things. A certain amount of agency gross income, a certain amount of cost, certain amount of margin. The pricing model is just a packaging thing. It's a presentation. It's how it's served up on the platter to the client, but underneath it all, it's atoms, right? It's all the same fundamental stuff.
Well, and I'll go. So now I'm having fun with this. What is most predictable out of those three elements? The revenue coming in, the people and the hours that you've purchased, or the overhead. I would argue that the most consistent thing in any agency is the money that you have to spend for those people that you've hired. That's not going to change.
And it's the thing you have the most control over.
Well, people want to avoid letting people go. That's another thing I found about agency owners. They're really attached to their people. But yeah, it is something that you have 100% control over. You can get rid of somebody. You can hire somebody. That's your decision. Mm-hmm. But it is the thing. If you say, okay, what are you most certain of over the next year? It's going to be those salaries. And it's going to be well, I leased an office, and I've got a subscription to Martech platform that somebody talked me into that I can't get out of. It's the people in the overhead, not the pricing. So anyway, I'm just really excited about this discrepancy from everything that I've heard after 10 years of talking to agencies where they describe everything on here's the new clients and here's what I can charge versus the thing that's most consistent and from hearing you talk, the most important, which is the costs.
Yeah. And it all comes back to, we start here because it answers the question of what would need to be true, right? Because then we can go and have that very exciting creative conversation of how do we go to market and what problems do we solve and who do we solve it for and how do we charge for that? And how do we structure this thing and deliver it? And all of those are important questions, but they should be anchored to an understanding of here's what needs to be true for this business to work and accomplish the goals that we set out as owners to accomplish with the business. Because what the heck's the point of all this if it's not getting us to that place? And we should be validating mathematically that that's possible, because that's not subjective. That is math. None of this is an opinion. It is a big math equation. The whole business is. So we should be aware of what that math equation is.
Mathematically before it can work out emotionally.
Correct. Yeah,
And
well,
I
strategically.
think where most agency owners are coming from, not to pick on their intellectual capacity, it's just I think it's based on their past experience, what they're passionate about. It's that emotional validation of like I feel it. I had a conversation with my client. They said this picture looked great. That's too marginalizing. But anyway, I've done this thing. I'm getting great validation from it. This is my worth, rather than practically sitting down and saying what's the math equation that's really going to make this work.
Yeah. And so in terms of sequencing, right, we start with the model. That's a thing. By the way, I'm going to do a plug here. If you want to develop a model of your agency for free, we have a model inside of our agency profitability toolkit. No cost to you, parakeeto.com/toolkit. There's a video, walks you through how to do it. And you can go through this exercise yourself and look at this math equation. So that's for all of you that are watching, all 100 million, 1,000 of you here on Max Trailers following. So step one, model. Step two, now that you know what the targets look like, the question is, are we on track to achieve those at any given point in time? So that's where forecasting comes in. And I won't get too deep into forecasting, but the big idea here with forecasting is we want to use a top-down forecasting approach, not a bottom-up forecasting approach. So the reason most agencies are still struggling with forecasting, even at scale, is because they're doing it in a way that is fundamentally not logical, which is they forecast by taking all of their planned work and projects and retainers, breaking those down into a bazillion little tasks, and then assigning those tasks to individual people, and then trying to build a high-level forecast out of those tiny little building blocks. Now, that seems like the only way to do it, doesn't it? I mean, conventional wisdom is, well, that's how you do a forecast, right? You assign tasks to individuals, and that's how you get to a capacity insight. But when you really think about what that means, if you look at like what is the reliability block diagram of that, which says the reliability of a system is only as reliable as each individual part. If I'm creating a system out of like 1,000 task assignments that all have a 1% chance of being inaccurate at any given moment in time, there is a 0% chance that my high-level forecast is accurate at any given moment in time. That's why this fails. It's unmanageable because the surface area and the complexity of all those little tiny idiosyncratic things is not something that anyone can reasonably maintain with a high degree of accuracy. So the answer to forecasting at the executive level is to actually make those blocks much bigger and rounder, so they're not as precise, but they remain accurate, and they're more fluid, which is more conducive to the conversation and the calculus that you're doing at the executive level, which is often a probability-based analysis of lots of different scenarios. What if we get a client? What if we lose a client? What if we hire a person? What if we fire a person? What if we change our rates? What if we start selling this new service, right? In order to be able to assess those things and then get an understanding of probability, like on a probability basis, where are we expecting to land, you need a much simpler, much more fluid forecasting system that doesn't attempt to go into that much detail and generally rolls things up to a handful of buckets, like how much design, development, project management, and strategy time is required from these projects and is available based on our team, which are all bucketed in these like very homogenized things that are kind of acting as an abstraction layer between that super detailed project management forecast and what we're doing up here. So I said I wasn't going to get deep into it, but then I went and did a little rant.
I have an insightful note here. It says big round blocks.
Yeah, very good, Max. Gold star.
Very, very good, Tim. Good talk. See you out there. Yeah, but I think that captures what you're saying. Is like we get too detailed. The bottom up approach is like, oh, we got all these little things that we can't really control. It's like, okay, that's good from a project management standpoint, but when you're talking about financial forecasting, you need bigger, rounder blocks. And I think what you're saying is align those blocks with like situational triggers. What if we lose somebody? What's the implication for our business if we lose somebody? What's the implication if we take on a new client, and sort of helping that to frame the conversation so that it's very like, oh, if this then that, versus here's a million friggin' numbers that are confusing.
Yeah, and it's more the idea that like structurally, if the way that I get to the answer of what happens if I lose this project is I now have to wade through 400 task assignments and update them all, that's too much friction. for me to actually be able to like enable that analysis. Whereas if I can get there by saying I update an estimate of hours across 5 buckets, design, project management, like that is much quicker. It's much less work. There's much less complexity involved. And so by simplifying it, I create a more fluid system. So it's actually it's better suited to supporting the reality of how we're actually having conversations and making decisions at the upper end of an organization, where we're usually looking at broader time horizons and we're looking at more uncertain scenarios that require fluidity. So the forecast.
Right, so I got number 1, model. Number 2, are we on track? I'd imagine there's forecasting. Number 3. You seem like a 1, 2, 3 guy.
I am, right? So we did model, we did forecast. Notice that both of those things are about the plan. What do we expect to happen? It's really a question of taking our expectations and modeling them into the future and saying, is that outcome aligned to what we expect and want? What we haven't gotten to yet is actuals. That's part 3. Okay, so now that we understand what we're expecting to happen from a revenue perspective, maybe a utilization perspective, a profit perspective, then the question is, okay, well, what's actually happening? So that's where we get into finance and time tracking data that we're pulling, we're cleaning, and we're comparing to the forecast, we're comparing to the plan, and we're looking for outliers. I want to just pause and say, notice that that's the last step, not the first one. I can't tell you how many people, Max, I see, they struggle with profitability. They go right to step 3. Let's start pouring tons of time and energy into finance. Let's start time tracking every friggin' thing in the entire business. And then they're surprised that they get no insight from it. Because the reality is, in order to get insight, you need to have the plan and the actuals to contrast against each other. If you get a number from me, 46% utilization, well, that doesn't mean anything to you unless you know that your target utilization was 57%.
Yeah, and why
it was 40%.
Yeah.
Right? So this is why we sequence it this way. We start with the plan because it's actually the fastest thing to do. It doesn't require any net new information, and it solves the problem of, are we actually planning for success? And then the last piece, which is the most complicated, is then we go and collect data about what's actually happening to compare against that and identify outliers. And we might not even need to do that if we're constantly on track to hit the plan and the money's flowing. Then we might even need to go down that path that reduces the urgency. So that's why that sequencing is really important, and it solves problems in the sequence of importance as well.
Again, I can't help but notice you're reversing the sequence of what most agency owners, how they look at their business.
Yeah. That happens a lot.
Yeah, I feel like that's an insightful insight.
I hope that it is.
Marcel, the opposite thinker.
It's kind of indicative of the problem with us, right? This is, I think, part of the reason that Parakeeto has been really hard for a long time. It's starting to feel like it's easier now, but we are doing things differently than conventional wisdom. And so there's a lot of unlearning that people need to do before they can embrace our way of doing things. It's quite a journey.
Well, when everything's going well, nobody wants Marcel's different opinion.
True.
When shit hits the fan and you're coming off of 4 years of the world is chaos, people start going, maybe the way we're doing it isn't the way we should be doing it. So I'm a fan. I'm always a fan of the polarized, like, let's go opposite direction. I'm always telling agencies, to hell with new logos. We should be thinking about growing your existing accounts. Nobody likes that. That's not the sexy thing. So, yeah.
It's sound advice, though.
I feel for you. Well, I mean, once you get to a certain size, would you not agree that a 10% improvement in retention and upsell is wildly more impactful than a 10% increase in Billy's sales ability?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of enterprise value as well, like if that NRR number flips from being under 100% to over 100%, I mean, you could be talking about several multiples on top of what
here's
you were
my
worth
financial
before.
literacy. My dad always said that the second check is easier than the first.
That's good advice.
Yeah, like that's my financial advisor right there. Um, well, cool. I appreciate you taking some extra time. I said that if we're having fun, I might abuse your time, so I appreciate that. But where can we find you on the LinkedIn's and otherwise? And
Yeah.
is there something like that's coming up recently, like something you're launching that you want to draw some attention to?
Yeah. Okay. All good questions. So LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm active on LinkedIn, and I post a lot of things that are specific to the topic that I shared today. So do follow me there. We recently launched a course that walks you through soup to nuts how to think about agency profitability. So that's something that you can check out at course.parakeeto.com. And of course, if you like what I talked about today, we have a podcast as well, the Agency Profit Podcast. You'll never guess what we talk about on that show. So recommend you go check that out as well. And I'll do a final plug for the toolkit. There's a lot of free things in there. They're all designed to help you get started measuring your profitability, understanding these metrics that I talked about today and many others that you should be tracking. And it's free. So encourage everyone to go grab a copy of that. We created it to try to make all of this a little bit more accessible to agency owners at no cost. So
Is that
do check
available
that
on
out.
your LinkedIn profile? Because I'm probably just going to send people there.
You know what? After this, before this gets published on the internet, it will be. I'll put it in
Feature,
my LinkedIn bio.
feature that thing.
That thing will be featured. It's a good idea.
Well, cool. I let me know where to make out the check. I feel more financially literate than I was before. I got a few people I need to introduce you to, and for those of you listening, yeah, don't binge on Beers with Max while operating heavy machinery. If you're chilling at home, by all means, get after it. And the zero BAC inhibit, yeah, partake,
Partake. Yeah,
partake.
check them out. They're great.
Happy partaking to the world. We're done here. Cheers.
Thanks, Max.